Hey class, I hope everyone's doing well. I hope you all had a good 4th of July. I hope you all had a good kind of catching back up last week. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Today we're going to be looking at what is taking place in North America. So far in our study of church history 2, we've looked at what is taking place. Um, on the continent, on in Europe, Great Britain, and that's really kind of where our focus has been so far for the Reformation. But today, we're going to start a shift towards looking at America and looking at the church in America primarily because that is our context that we primarily live and serve. And so today we're going to look at America, and we're going to start going all the way back to 1607 in Jamestown. We're going to see that what happens in colonial America. So we're going to start there, start looking at what's happening in colonial America and some developments there. So remember, this is 1607. This is before the 30 Years' War. This is before the Synod of Dort. So a lot of things are still yet to come. So just want to point that out to kind of give you a framework, a point of reference, if you will. So this has taken us a good bit, but it's still after the time of Luther. So after the time of Luther, but then before the 30 Years' War, before the Synod of Dort, before a lot of those things were finalized. So one of the questions that arises when looking at history is, why are all these people leaving Europe to come to the New World? Why is there this exodus of people leaving Europe coming to the New World? And there's a lot of complexities as to why you would have colonization in this way. They include just religious warfare in Europe. So the wars taking place in Europe, remember, are predominantly religious based. So, and if you're on the wrong side of the religious war, you want to get out because, as you should remember, uh, the religious team in power, if you will, certainly did not hesitate in persecuting those that was not on the same team. So there's religious warfare in Europe. Secondly, there's wealth and power, just created and granted many new opportunities for people when coming to the New World. And then thirdly, there's just some other religious reasons. So one, yeah, so they can avoid religious persecution for sure. By and large, those in England, uh, the place to go to is the colonies. Some would go to the Netherlands. That was certainly an option for those in England. But by and far, the colonies are the place to go. The fear was, for those who went to the Netherlands, was that over time you would lose your English identity. You could go to the New World with a bunch of English people, and you wouldn't have to necessarily be losing or be at risk of losing your English identity. So you want to go with the rest of the British to the New World. And secondly, in just the sweep of colonization, uh, those who want to avoid persecution would want to kind of just jump on the ship. And so, again, religious warfare and religious persecution, or some of the religious reasons why people would want to jump on the ship and come on over. So, in England, there are three groups that makes their way to the New World. So, looking at England specifically right now, there's three groups that make their way to the New World. The first group is the Church of England Loyalists. They would also be called Royalists. So um, the second group is the Church of England Puritans. And then the third group is the Puritan Separatists. So that would be the Pilgrims that we would think of. And so the Church of England Loyalists, they come to expand their own vision of the church. They're granted charters for massive amounts of land, and they want wealth and power as well. The Church of England Puritans, they had no voice in the Church of England, and so they want to come to America and establish like a city on a hill. They want to show England what life would be like if they were in charge. So they come and establish their Puritan utopia to shine light back into England. They were more Presbyterian connectional in how they operated than Episcopal. And then that third group, the Pilgrims, the Puritan separatists. Uh, Baptists eventually emerged from this tradition, this separatist tradition. And there's religious persecution because they were breaking the law because they weren't part of the Church of England. And so, again, that's why they're coming. So, three different groups coming for three different reasons. The Loyalists, they wanted to establish their own, to expand their own vision of the church. So the Church of England wanted to come and expand as is. The Church of England Puritans want to come start fresh and kind of be like a city on a hill to shine light back into Europe to say, hey, if you make these reforms, then it can be as good as we have it here. And then the separatists, they just were escaping the persecution because they were breaking the law because they weren't part of the Church of England. That's why they're the separatists. So for England itself, for England, the purpose in coming to the New World and establishing these colonies is for power. But for those who participate in it, the reasons are far more complex. So looking at a few developments, a few colonial developments, I want to take a moment and look at Plymouth. So Plymouth was settled by Puritan separatists. Uh, they had initially gone to the Netherlands, but ended up working with Virginia Company to get to the New World. So on the way, they realized that they landed far more north than Virginia than they had planned on, so they decided to govern themselves under the king. And this became known as the Mayflower Compact. So the first few months after landing were tragic, and they lost about half of their group. But the Indians eventually taught them how to survive. And in America, over time, these Puritan separatists eventually become known as Congregationalists. And with the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Connecticut, I want to talk about those for a moment. Massachusetts Bay Colony and Connecticut. So this is Church of England Puritans fleeing from persecution. So they formed the Massachusetts Bay Company. And they also found Connecticut. So these are Church of England Puritan colonies. They not only established themselves, but they're running them as well. Because remember, the point of the Puritans coming over is to establish a city on the hill, shine light, and say, hey, remember, if you make these reforms like we did, this is what it could be like. So not only do they establish these colonies, but they run them as well. And so to maintain their utopia, they created a religious test for serving in government. So when the colony became a state, there was actually still this test in place, and it persisted until the Bill of Rights. So it was through lawsuits that it was eventually ruled unconstitutional. And it's important to note, though much later on, that the U.S. Constitution says the United States government can't establish any kind of religion, not the states. Later on, the Supreme Court said that that part of the Constitution did apply to the states too, but initially that's not how it was written. It was written that the federal government could not establish a religion, not that the states couldn't. So these colonies and states, they want to keep their distinctive religiousness. It sometimes goes unnoticed or unrealized that there was a religious test for office, but indeed it was true. These colonies being established by these religious groups wanted to maintain that distinctiveness about them. So in Massachusetts and Connecticut, you can only have Church of England Puritan churches. The Baptists or the Separatists, they get kicked out. And later on, you could get a license to preach, but if you are found without a license, then you would go to jail. Kind of other developments taking place in terms of the colonies being established. Church of England Loyalists, they come and establish Virginia. And here you also subscribe to the established religion of the colony. So the governor was royally appointed. And here you see the separatists continue to get pushed further and further south as well. And Charles, takes land from Virginia to create Maryland for Roman Catholicism. And so, if you remember, the Roman Catholics kind of fly under the radar. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead a couple of lectures. So if you remember that Charles secretly wanted to be a Roman Catholic and was making that push to make England Catholic again. So he comes to the throne, takes land from Virginia, creates Maryland for the Roman Catholics. Uh, but then the Anglicans eventually come in, beat them up, and take over, and then kick out the Catholics. So this is the vision of the founding of the American colonies. It's a multiplex and competing interest of religion. So each colony was founded with a different religious context that is not interchangeable. Each colony is radically different and is based off religion. And so again, that's the vision of the founding of America. That's how these colonies were initially created. It was religious. It was based on religion. It was based on uh, specific specific traditions within the Christian faith. And so each colony again is radically different, not interchangeable. This is, if you're in a loyalist colony, that's the church. That's what you need to be a part of. If you don't like that, then you need to move. And so, in all of this, in this kind of multiplex of competing interests of religion, there's two champions of true religious freedom that stand out. And so, again, these people coming over, these groups coming over, establishing these colonies, again, it's not religious freedom for anyone except for those who established the colony and decided what the religion would be. But in that, there's two leaders, William Penn and Roger Williams, again, and they stick out because they advocated for true, real religious freedom. So for William Penn, excuse me, he came to the New World for the purpose of providing a haven for religious freedom. So Penn was a Quaker, and this group had experienced great persecution. So Penn was actually arrested for being a Quaker. He did eventually get out because of his family status, a wealthy family, and he received a charter of land from King Charles II in order to pay a debt that was owed to Penn's father. So, upon receiving that charter, Penn set sail for the New World in 1681. He would go on to establish Pennsylvania, and he considered it a holy experiment. Where there was true religious freedom, where there was true freedom of religion. Um, Also to note, the First Baptist Association was in Philadelphia. I just keep bringing that up, referencing Baptist, one, because that is my own tradition, but two, they did experience great persecution even in the New World. So that's what William Penn. He came over to establish Pennsylvania and was an advocate there for true religious freedom. The other leader then is Roger Williams. So he establishes the colony of Rhode Island for the purpose of, again, religious freedom. So Roger Williams was a Baptist for a short time, and as a Baptist, he was motivated to pursue religious freedom. Uh, Brown University is founded, and he made sure that in order to sit on the board of directors, there is no religious test or persuasion. This includes non-Christian religion as well. Penn was the same. True religious freedom. And so these people, William Penn, Roger Williams, out of all the colonies, these two do establish these colonies for true religious freedom. Again, doesn't even have to be a Christian faith. You can come and practice any religion that you want to. And so I don't want you to miss why these guys are so important. As you look down the colonies and you kind of visualize the colonies, this colonial map, we've all seen them. As you look down the colonies, you see complexity. You don't see diversity. And there's a difference between the two. You see complexity. You go to one colony, you see one religious persuasion that's allowable. You go to another, and it's another persuasion that's allowable. You go somewhere else, and your persuasion is illegal. So that's going to cause problems when you try to get these groups to work together. Why should they work together? They all have, their main interest, that is, a specific form of religion, and then if you go anywhere else, it's illegal. So something's going to have to come over, or something's going to have to overcome these religious differences, and that's ultimately going to be the Revolutionary War and a new confederation of states. What created this environment to not want to be joined together is religion. That's why, again, the First Amendment said that only the U.S. government can't apply a religion because they still had their religious tests, they had their religious importance. That's the one thing that would stop these states from coming together is their religion. None of these groups really have the same vision. For every group, they have different views. They all have their own interests, those kinds of things. So that's the situation in the early to mid 1600s. There are several colonies that have been founded, and each was founded for its own religious purposes. That's not to say that everyone was religious, because what you end up with is a population that says they're Christian, but they don't go to church. So very quickly, within one generation, Christianity becomes cultural, which leads to the First Great Awakening. So, in looking at the First Great Awakening, there's a few things that lead up to it. So, again, the situation that the church was facing is that there were many religious people in the church and on the membership roll, but there were far less people who were actually converted and far less people actually came to church. So, you would end up with, say, 500 on the roll, 250 would show up, and 25 were actually converted. That's kind of the situation taking place during the First Great Awakening. And this was because you had preachers like Solomon Stoddard, whose main concern was to see that Christian congregations were going to continue to grow. So Stoddard was the grandfather of Jonathan Edwards, who you may have heard about. And Stoddard's church and others like his was a place where religion and religious beliefs were being preached, not the gospel. Again, there's a difference. So the place where the gospel was least proclaimed was at the church. Preaching the gospel is not the same as tacking it on at the end of a sermon of 5 steps to a happy home. That's not the same. Preaching the gospel is not the same as tacking it on for the last couple of minutes of a sermon about 5 steps to having a happy home. Not the same. So that's a situation where they found it where preachers, were more concerned about maintaining a Christian religious influence in society and wasn't too concerned about preaching the gospel in the church. And so one thing that Solomon Stoddard pushes for is called the halfway covenant. And so this is where people would maintain a partial membership in the church even though they were not converted. So the goal here was to try and keep the church influential in society and to give people a taste of what full membership looked like. And the way they did this was that if you were a child of a church member, then you could be baptized. And you had to be baptized because you were part of the covenant, because your parents were part of the covenant. This is how they sought to raise religious and pious people in society. Because remember, the colonies were founded on religious purposes. So with Stoddard, though, he was concerned about the amount of unregenerate people in the church, so he began to advocate the idea that the Lord's Supper could be given to religious, though unconverted people, and that the participation in communion would be a converting act. So he didn't think that the Bible made a claim that only regenerate people could partake of the Lord's Supper. So these churches that had held to this begin to see the Lord's table as a converting ordinance, in which the focus and the participation of the church and the Lord's table is not, can we fence it off to keep people from partaking it, so that it becomes an exclusionary event, but can we open it wide so that people can be saved? So what determined who partook of the table was if one was religious. It became a proclamation of the gospel to those churches because they were preaching no other gospel. They weren't actually doing any preaching of the gospel. So this, of course, still left a lot of lost people in the church because eating bread and drinking wine does not save you. It is a tangible proclamation of the gospel, but it doesn't save. So that's what he was doing. They were to maintain kind of this Christian religious influence in society. Stoddard had come up with this halfway covenant where, again, people could be partial members of churches, um, and in order to have them converted, uh, you could partake of the Lord's Supper. And and because again, he didn't think they required that the scriptures require conversion in order to partake of the Lord's Supper. So then in the 1730s and 40s, something begins to happen, and that is a series of revivals. Not because they preached gospel outside of the church, but to the church. They made a distinction between what it means to be converted and what it means to be a church member. So this was somewhat a response to the failing of the halfway covenant. So these revivals that we call the Great Awakening were transatlantic and they were interdenominational. So again, they happened here in the New World and they were happening in Europe as well. And they go by two different names. In England, it was called the Evangelical Awakening. In America, we call it the First Great Awakening. And they are two manifestations of the same broader movement. So there were three key leaders in this movement. The first was a New England pastor named Jonathan Edwards. He was a primary theologian. He was the primary theologian of the revival. He was a Calvinist and a Congregationalist, and his ministry, other than through his books, was confined to North America. So his books did get out of North America, but he never traveled. He wasn't out traveling outside of North America. The second key leader was George Whitefield. He was a traveling itinerant evangelist, and he was a Calvinist. So unlike Edwards, he was an Anglican, so he was a member of the Church of England. And Whitefield is a key leader in North America and England, though he is a native Englishman. And the third main leader in the Great Awakening is John Wesley. So like Whitefield, he was an Anglican and evangelist, but unlike Whitefield and Edwards, he was an Arminian. And he forms a movement, Methodism, and his only trip to America was actually before he was famous. And so those were the three key leaders within the First Great Awakening. And one question needing to be answered during this time was, how do you know what was going on was a movement of the Spirit? That was kind of a main question that a lot of Christians were trying to answer, throughout throughout this awakening, was how do you know this is a movement of the Spirit? So Wesley was especially critical of what was going on. He so believed in order that he even wondered if people could be saved outside of the church building. They were critical of what was going on because of the emotionalism that was accompanying this movement. So Jonathan Edwards wrote several things defending that was a movement of the Spirit of God. And those works is on religious affections and marks of the work of the true Spirit. Those were his best works in this regard. So in Marx, he starts out by giving negative signs. That is, what are measurements that we ought not to use? And they include the first being that there are not particular or practical methods that ought to be the means by which you test something. So just because it doesn't fit the standards we are used to doesn't mean that it isn't a spirit or isn't a move of the Spirit of God. Wide diversity of thinking doesn't mean it's not a work of the Spirit. So that's the first thing, the first test. Just because it doesn't fit the standards, just because it doesn't fit what we're used to, doesn't mean it's not a movement of the Spirit of God. Secondly, just because people are so overcome by the fear of hell and their sin that they pass out or have other bodily functions doesn't mean it isn't a work of the Spirit. Thirdly, just because people are claiming visions doesn't mean it's wrong. Then fourthly, ongoing persistent sin of those affected during the revival is to be expected. It's called salvation, not perfection. So again, if they were still sinning after the revival, after their salvation, that's to be expected. It's to be expected. And then he does list some positive signs as well. The first is that when people raise the esteem of Jesus, that's the first thing, that people raise the esteem of Jesus. So the question isn't about emotionalism, but does the esteem of Jesus increase? Only the real biblical Jesus, only real biblical salvation does that. Do people have a greater esteem of the real Jesus? Secondly, when the Spirit operates against Satan's kingdom. Thirdly, when the Spirit causes people to have a greater regard for the Holy Scriptures. Fourthly, it's revival if it leads you to greater love of God and greater love of neighbor. Again, if it's not a work of God, then it's not going to lead to these things. Satan isn't going to have you have a greater regard of Scripture. Satan isn't going to make you want to esteem and worship and praise Jesus and make his name great all the more. Satan isn't going to want to lead you to have a greater love of God and neighbor. Um, so those were some positive signs when you see these things happening, and if these things are happening. So he says, don't use presence of the strange or odd as a measure of the Spirit. Instead, look to the other side. A move of Satan is not going to lead to a greater esteem of Jesus. So, there were some, kind of crazy things going out. People passing out, making weird noises, all those kinds of things during these revival services. And so that's what really led people to try and determine, is this really a God thing or is it not? And so for Edwards, revival is not something that shouldn't be perpetual. The idea is that once you are awake, you don't drift back in slumber. He becomes suspicious, and Edwards, he's just kind of becomes suspicious of the next big thing. And so there's a few outcomes of this first Great Awakening. So the first, one outcome is that unity is based on affinity, not geography. So the Great Awakening did have its doubters. You also have Christians who are opposed to what was going on, and those who were opposed was known as Old Lights. So those who were more accepting of the revival was known as New Lights. So their arguments against the revivals was that this was emotionalism. People were barking like dogs and all kinds of things. So as this was happening, the movement of the revivals up and down the colonies means that the networking that churches do are beyond their own association of churches. Different types of churches become more in common with each other based on their view of the First Great Awakening. So denominations start traversing, and people start traversing across the colonies. So the awakenings are like a unifying movement. So by the 1770s, people are joined together across the country. People are joined together based on affinity, not geography. And then secondly, you see a decline in church attendance, actually. And what is interesting to note is that regular church attenders, decline after the revival. The difference is that those who go are actually Christians now. The number of Christians increase. People, again, the gospel is being proclaimed, not 5 steps to a happy home. And so the impact of religion on church attendance is diminished when the gospel is the basis for people gathering at church. Again, the impact of religion on church attendance is diminished when the gospel is the basis for people who gather at church. When all you do is preach the gospel, you get people who are converted and stay, or people who leave. Again, when all you do is preach the gospel, you get people who are converted and stay because they love it, because they love God, or you get people who leave. And so the result of this Great Awakening is more Christians, but less church attenders. And so that's going to wrap up our discussion today on the First Great Awakening and kind of what was happening in early colonial America at the time. And so I'll be posting a discussion question and look forward to seeing your responses. Take care.